plenty of room in here. You can find a seat. Can see up there going from 45 minutes. I don't know if that's too hard. Don't worry about it. And he came here during Christmas week, as he said, and I'm really, really grateful for him making that commitment to come. So thank you again. Flying in last night, and I think we're leaving pretty early. I think I drew the short straw, and I'm taking you to the airport. I think I have to get up at, I don't even think, I'm just going to stay awake all night.
Yeah, you might need to.
What time was it, like 4 o'clock, or we need to leave?
Yeah, the flight's at 6:30. So.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, it'll be a privilege. I'm a morning person, so we'll be fine.
Me too. Yeah.
All right. Very good. Well, yeah, thanks. And we had a lot of questions, and so I'm just going to say we probably aren't going to get to all of them, and I apologize for that. But here we're just going to jump into them. And so I had a group of people that kind of culled these questions and pulled them to me, so I'm just reading them fresh for the first time myself. So the first question here is that when you look at a church like ours, where do we begin to do the type of work that needs to be done, as you talked about this morning? Where would we begin?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a lot of different ways you can start, but one of the things that's really important to begin with is individually doing some kind of self-awareness and beginning to do a little bit of the work yourself, right? One of the things we've talked about over the years in this work is a lot of times people want strategies and they want the church to be multi-ethnic when their lives aren't really multi-ethnic. And so what has to happen first is there has to be a real commitment personally to doing some of the work internally. And that can look a lot of different ways. Reading, building relationships cross-culturally, putting yourself in situations where it may be trainings or things that may help bring a level of awareness and knowledge. There's something called cultural intelligence that many people are studying this field. And one of the things that we found in cultural intelligence is that cultural intelligence can be it's something that can be increased. It's something that can be improved. And there's 4 parts to the wheel. The first part of the wheel is called drive. And drive is a person's personal motivation, right? Their desire to learn, to grow. The second is knowledge. And that's just simply beginning to understand different cultures. But what has a tendency to happen is we focus on the first 2 and we don't deal with the next 2, right? So drive, I used to think that people were intrinsically motivated. I soon learned that that's not always the case, but our culture has a tendency to push people to knowledge. And knowledge is great, right? Where we read or we do all that kind of stuff. But you have to get past knowledge. The third part of the CQ wheel is strategy. And strategy is when you, based on what you know, you begin to strategize how you approach things differently. And then the fourth part of the CQ wheel is what we call action. And that is where you start to make the determination, how much of myself in this scenario or this situation do I need to bring to this, and how much do I need to let go in order for this to be something that we all win. And that's difficult. And so the internal work is the first part of the process. I brought a book that we're using at our church. We've been using it for years in the denomination. And it's something I'm recommending individually to you, and I'd recommend for the church. It's called Multiethnic Conversations. It's written by 2 friends of mine, Mark Demaz and Onia Akube. And it can be used in 3 different ways. One is as a personal devotion. So it goes over the course of 8 weeks. It covers theology, relationships, culture, all those kinds of things. You read for about 5 to 10 minutes, and you answer questions. So it can be a personal devotion. The second way it can be used is like a small group curriculum or a leadership cohort type thing, where a group of people walk through it together and process it, periodically, once a week, every other week, what have you. And then the third way it can be used is kind of like a sermon series on this particular topic. And what I love about it is it's sound both in its theology and ecclesiology. And you'll notice that about me. Like, I'll keep bringing us back to Scripture because it's so easy to get caught in this other stuff that we got to come back to, what did God say? Like, what does the Scripture say? And that's got to be where we start. But those are just a few ways we can begin. And I'd say have different on-ramps, right? Every church, everybody's not going to come into the conversation in the same place. Like, some people, this will be very new to them and they won't, have a lot of experience. Others of you, you've been having this conversation, a little more regularly. And then there are others of you who maybe like me, like this is a field of study for you. It's something that you've been immersed in professionally or, what have you, for a long period of time. And so what we offer as a church needs to be accessible to people at all those levels. And that's an important part of what the church would have to figure out, how to create the right pace for people at those different spaces or levels.
That's really helpful. And I think, and again, this is being recorded, so you can share this with people on social media or whatever that are part of our church and aren't here for this conversation. But I think it's important for maybe you all to know kind of a little bit about how it came to be that Santes is here. And so this is something that started in my heart for a while, but really more intensely over the last 3 or 4 years. And then at our long-range planning session, Santes, we have every February. In advance of that, this is when our board and our staff gathers for a longer period of time than just regular meetings. I had a list of about 15 books, or I asked our leaders to read a book around some of these issues, and we had some suggested readings. And then we just gathered in a long-range session, and we just said, what did you learn? What did you know? So when you talk about those 2 wheels, or those 2 parts of that wheel, the motivation or the drive was there in me and in our staff and in our board. And we made an effort then for the knowledge, but boy, the strategy and the action is kind of where I don't want to say we're stuck, but that's where we're at as a church, as leadership anyway, to know the next step. So talking about this book that you have, we're really interested in following up with that. But that's part of why Santes is here, because as we start thinking about how do we take this conversation to the larger church body, we said that as we're thinking about sermon series, we're going to see where this conversation fits in. And so when we laid out this great news I bring you good news of great joy for all people. It's just like, in fact, it wasn't even, no offense, but it wasn't my idea to bring you here. One of our staff persons says, what if we bring Santes Beatty in? And I remember saying, I said, we can't, that won't work. I mean, he's too busy. He's got all these things going on. So I just wanted you to know kind of how that fit in with the conversation. I want our church to know that this is a journey we're on at the leadership level, and this is a great next step. So that's really helpful. Okay, here's a question. What is the appropriate approach to the Black Lives Matters for us as Christians, for white, African American, and others, and how do Black Lives Matters leaders react to you?
To me personally?
I would assume that's what they're saying in the question here.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, let me frame it with a story that may help explain where I'm coming from. So my maternal grandmother passed away from COVID last year, actually earlier this year. And right before COVID, literally the week COVID hit, we were planning to have a birthday party to celebrate her 100th birthday. And we had to cancel. Her birthday is the 21st of March. COVID hit pretty heavy the week before, so we had to cancel everything. But imagine that we had it, and all of us show up at, we call a MUH. All of us show up for MUH's celebration, and we're at the height of the celebration. She's about to be handed the mic to share from her heart, as only MUH could do. And then somebody else in the crowd stands up and says, "It's my birthday this week too. And we shouldn't just be celebrating MUH, we should be celebrating my birthday too." Now, all of us in the room would probably lovingly grab that person and say, although we appreciate you and we value you, like, this is not the time for that, right? We are here to celebrate MUH. And so I think what happens sometimes with the Black Lives Matter movement in the church is that we have struggled to understand how to share space and how to celebrate or deal with pain. Now, the truth is, there are a lot of things about the Black Lives Matter movement, BLM, that I don't agree with personally or that I have challenges with. But there are also a lot of things in the local church that I don't agree with and I have challenges with. And I don't throw out everything with the church because there are a few things that I disagree with or I don't value. And so one of our challenges is to learn how to share space with people who may approach things differently. The Black Lives Matter movement is one of the first movements in what we would call the civil rights movement, social justice movement of its kind that did not start with the church. So important to remember. It's one of the few that did not start with the church. And the reason why that's significant is people were hurting, people were looking for answers, and unfortunately the church was silent. And because the church was silent, it inferred a level of complicity, and people created a movement because usually the church would have stepped up. But in this situation, the church didn't. And so what often happens when we dialogue with the BLM movement is we sometimes as a church find ourselves being critical of the movement, but the reality is it is an indictment against the complicity and the silence of the church that would allow that to happen. And so there's a sense in which we have to own the fact that this movement began because of our silence and because we were not actively engaging this. And we should not judge too harshly if that group that started it was not Christian-based and was not theologically sound. But there's a lot we could learn from the movement. There's a lot we can learn from people who are on the front lines. And you always, in every movement, you're always going to have people who are a little, let's just say, a little far on one end and some that are not so far on the other end. But I've found that there's something to be said when I sit with people who are doing this kind of work, and I learn. And so just like there would be in the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, you had Martin Luther King Jr., you had the Malcolm X's. They didn't agree with each other all the time, but it required different parts of the movement to keep the movement going. And what happened in that movement, even with those two figures, for example, what got them killed was that they both began to move to the center, right? So the reality is part of the challenge of the Black Lives Matter movement is the church has to posture itself always from a place of sound theology and ecclesiology, but also we have to learn from Jesus. Jesus was a person who sat with and worked alongside of people he disagreed with or people who he wanted to reach. And unfortunately, what has happened too often is that we've distanced ourselves from people rather than sitting with them and learning from them and then offering what we would share. So I think, yes, there are some people who would argue there are parts of the tenets of BLM that would be difficult for some Christians to digest. But the truth is that's true of a lot of things. And I often ask the question, do you fold that same paradigm over everything else in your life? Right? That there are other things in your life where you would disagree with the tenets of the people who lead it, that you wouldn't agree with everything that they do. Do you fold that same analysis over everything? And if you do, praise God. Great. But if you don't, then it reveals a blind spot that you may have to look at. And that's the tension that I have. And I think they would view me as someone that at times we would vehemently disagree with each other. And then at other times we would totally be in support of each other. Because I think at the base level, when we talk about that conversation with Muzz birthday party, what Black Lives Matter basically means is that all lives matter. What it basically means is that blue lives matter. That's what, at its core, that's what it actually means. But sometimes because of politics and all these other things, we get lost in the he said, she said, comparing pain, when the reality is simply saying we're all made in the Imago Dei, and some people are not experiencing that, and we need to expose that. That's what the movement is really about. But, you know, it can get hijacked with politics and other stuff, and that's always what happens, and that seems to be sometimes what happens with us. But we have to be careful in our platform as Christian leaders. Like, what we promote is the kingdom. Are you with me? Like, not political movements, not social movements. We promote the kingdom. And so, like, even, I'll bring it up in our church, but only in the context of Scripture. Only in the context of Scripture, right? And so I don't bring it up as a political movement or invite people from the BLM to talk from our pulpit. That's not how I approach it. We address the same issues we would from Scripture, just like we did today. Like, if we're going to talk about for all people, we're going to talk about it in the context of Ephesians 2, right? So that's something I always say to people. You can bring these things up, but never bring them up from this platform. Like, you can do it on a nonprofit or something else, but from this platform, it needs to be through the lens of what did God say in Scripture and how do we live that out as believers, as a church. Yep.
Fantastic. That's great. So the next question is, how do we expose our children to the diversity of all people in a community with less diversity than Mosaic? And I assume Mosaic meaning your church there. How do we help our kids sort of?
Yeah, that's a great. One of the, I was in South Dakota once, and there's certain parts of South Dakota that the only thing brown is cows. Come on, say amen. Now there are other parts of South Dakota, you know, reservations and things of that nature, Lakota, and different indigenous people groups. But and this question comes up quite often in these kinds of spaces. And I would just say, like, if the pandemic didn't teach us anything, it taught us that we are far more connected and global than we've ever been. And so even though geographically or from a demographic standpoint, we may be limited in our ability to see and experience people at different ethnic and racial categories, one of the questions I always ask people is, what does Walmart look like? Like when you go in your local Walmart, is Walmart diverse? And if you tell me that your local Walmart is not diverse, then I will come back with another set of questions. But if you tell me that when you show up at your local Walmart, that you see diversity, then I ask the question, like Walmart is not the only one that saves. Some of y'all get that tomorrow. I need the drummer, Jamie. I know that was terrible, dad joke. But like there's something, if Walmart is drawing a diverse group of people, the question becomes, why aren't we? If Walmart is able to reach people and for some reason they decide to come and be a part of it, and you name the organization that is doing it, the question becomes what approach do we need to take, or what things could we do differently to reach people? But to go back to the question, I think one, you can do so electronically and digitally. I highly recommend, Facebook I know it gets a bad rap and it's called Meta now and all that kind of stuff, but there are a lot of different groups that you can join to do some of this kind of work. Facebook is just one social media platform where you can do it. But I think you have to decide that it's a priority and that you're going to create spaces where your children can be in community, whether it be virtual or in person. One of the things I've tried to do with my kids is strategically think throughout the year, what are things that I'm exposing them to? That I don't just, have them join a basketball league or a, choir or a, cooking class randomly. I try to think through, okay, what are some places where I'm going to have them in a space that's different than what they're used to, or that will cause them to connect with people they normally wouldn't connect with. And so as parents, we have to be very strategic about how we expose our kids. And at times, they won't understand, right? Why am I not doing, basketball over here with my friends? It's because you around them all the time, right? Like you're gonna do basketball with them during the school year, but like over the summer, let's try another league, right? Let's try a league of people that you may not. So like being very strategic about how you do that, and using technology in many ways that you can. I would suggest even that there are churches that we could start doing some of this kind of work, crossing, lines. And, almost like this, we used to have the, what do you call it, pen pal kind of thing we used to do back in the day where you write people from other parts of the world. I think there are ways that we can incorporate very creatively ways to do that. I think our kids would love to connect with kids here. We can go on missions trips together, right? Even though we're not around each other, but we can do missions trip together. And people don't just need to come to Detroit, right? We need to come to Kansas, right? Because they're broken and hurting people here, just like they're broken and hurting people in Detroit. And so finding those kind of creative ways to do things together can be helpful, and can cause some of the walls to come down. Like you notice I use humor a lot. I didn't start that way. Like I was that, let's talk about it, we're gonna deal with it. And then people would just like leave. And I'd be like, they don't like the truth. I'm like, no, they don't like the truth when you bang it over their head, right? Like people want to talk, they want to engage, sometimes you need to have things that bring people's defenses down so that they can actually hear. And so we just have to create those strategies with our kids. And they are primed and ready to do the work. They are primed and ready to build the relationships. We just have to help create avenues for it. Or ask them questions. Like sometimes they'll come up with ideas that'll blow your mind. Like we moved into our neighborhood and we bought way too much stuff. And we did a yard sale. And my girls were like, we're gonna do a lemonade stand. And I was like, okay. And so they got out there and did the lemonade stand. How about those two girls began to connect with everybody in the community, and they knew names and everything, and I'm sitting over there at the table like, what about me and the furniture we trying to get rid of? But they figured out a way to connect in ways that I wasn't thinking about if I didn't ask them and invite them into the conversation. So there are a lot of different ways. Technology, partnerships across state lines, maybe even across national lines. Involve yourself with some things that maybe happen in the school systems. Some of the local schools, some of the libraries, some of the colleges and universities, they're already doing this work. And so you can tap into some of that, what's happening in your community. You don't have to create the wheel. Sometimes the wheel is already spinning. You just got to jump on.
You know, I think the thing I appreciated about your sermon this morning was the humor and the way, like, I don't think any of us will ever go to a Popeyes again.
I know. Make sure they got some chicken.
And not think about your story. Now, I mean, I didn't mean we'll never go to a Popeyes again. I was a comma there. We'll never go to the Popeyes again and not think about, you know, if Popeyes is about chicken, why was there no chicken? If the church is about reconciliation, why is there no reconciliation? I mean, I think that was a powerful thing, and that was meaningful. And I think, Santes, your definition or your illustration of privilege with a water bottle was powerful. I think that's a word, if I can just, you know, I think that's a word that many of us that are white have a knee-jerk reaction to, especially for people who are on the lower socioeconomic end of things, or who've had a hard time with life, where life has been hard for them for whatever reason, to be told, oh, you have privilege, and to not understand it, I think creates like this defensiveness for white people.
Yeah.
And I think the way you framed that with the water bottle was incredible. And this isn't one of the questions. I guess maybe just digging a little bit more on that issue of privilege, and helping us understand. And I mean, this is a conclusion I came to. It's just I need to understand that. I don't have to apologize for the family I was born into. I was born as a Christian. I was born into a privileged situation. Both grandfathers, pastors, Like, for me to not follow Jesus, I would have had to try really hard to run from him, right? And to just know that and to steward that. So I don't know if there's any more you'd want to speak on that issue, but I really like the water bottle illustration. I wonder if you could help us understand a little bit more how we should respond to that idea of privilege. Yeah,
it's been hijacked, right? Like that word has been hijacked, and it's one of those things that it's unfortunate that when people bring that term up, that it gets linked with shame and so much that it's not really supposed to be. I'll never forget, I was a higher ed administrator years ago, and I oversaw multicultural education, and one of the areas I oversaw was like the work that the college was doing with those who've had some type of disability. And I went to this conference in DC, and one of the young men who was with us had just, like, his electric wheelchair had broken. And so I was responsible for, like, pushing him around DC, right? And I have never thought about my able-bodiedness the way I did that day. Like, everywhere we went, I had to think about, how is this going to work for him? Is the aisle wide enough? Is the handle low enough? When we go to eat at a table, is it where he can actually slide under like, I never thought about it until I had to do that day with him. And it was a wake-up call for me about other areas of my life. When we are in a place of privilege, we don't always have to think about it, right? And so my able-bodiedness is not a bad thing. It's just that put next to his being in a wheelchair and inability to walk, I began to see how my able-bodiedness showed up in ways I didn't think about before. And so privilege is one of those things where it's not because people, like, trust me, like, I know poor white folk. Come on, say amen. I know poor white folk who struggle financially, who've pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. You know, I know. So privilege is not about what we have or our struggle. It's really about understanding that there's some things that we don't necessarily have to think about the same way another person does. And it's important just to be aware of it, right? It's just important to be aware of it. And so with me, it didn't make me a bad person because I could walk. It made me somebody that, because of that, I didn't have to think about all those things like he did. And I needed to learn how to think that way. I needed to learn how to appreciate his struggle. And that's part of what privilege is all about. It's not that you have it. See, we get so caught up with whether or not people are telling us we have it. That's not really the issue. The issue is, what do we do with it? Like, that's more important than acknowledging that you have it. But part of the journey of learning and self-awareness is to know that I have it. I have male privilege, right? There are things that my wife deals with that I'll never have to deal with because I'm a man, right? And so I if I learn that and I understand how to leverage that for the benefit of people who are around me, then the privilege is a blessing. It's not a something that is something to be blamed for. Does that make sense? And too often it becomes a weapon to make white people feel guilty or shame, and that's not what it should be about. It should just simply be, let's be aware of places where things we don't have to think about that other people do, and let's leverage what we have for the good of everyone.
And I love how you tied that to Philippians, too. That's what Jesus did.
Yep.
He set that aside for others. And again, anchoring this conversation in theology and ecclesiology is really powerful.
And that passage is about self-emptying.
Exactly.
So, for example, Jesus put his privilege and his power and his position aside at certain moments when it's going to help. And then he picks it up when it's going to help.
Yeah, right.
He sits it aside when it's not going to help. He picks it up when it will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good.
That's what we're supposed to do with our privilege. We sit it aside when it's not going to help. So, for example, like, there are moments when I get on an airplane, like coming here, it's not helpful to tell people I'm a pastor.
Amen.
It's not helpful. They shut down. They don't want to talk. Sometimes they'll wave their hand. Can you give me another seat? Like, there are times when, like, I don't bring it up. I'm just talking. I'm just people. We just trying to get where we're going. And then there are other times when I'm listening and I start to discern, oh, it might be helpful now to bring this up, right? But I sit it down when it's not going to help me and it's not going to help this dynamic. But I pick it up when it will. That's what we should do with privilege.
So with that, which is not a new thought for me, but I want to expand on that a little bit. So, Santes, you're saying as white people sometimes we need to pick up our white privilege for the sake of others who don't have it. And I think that's maybe, like, I think it's easy to say, I recognize I have privilege and you don't, how can I serve you? But there are times where we have to be the ones who, because I've had black people tell me this in certain situations, you need to stand, you need to say something now. I've been saying this, now it's time for you. Yes. So it's not just a matter of recognizing we have privilege and setting it aside, because I think that's how we tend to think, that that's what we as white people are supposed to do. But that's a very key point, I think. Like, sometimes we need to pick that privilege up and say, as with my influence now, I need to speak to this issue because others are trying to hear if they're not being heard. And again, that's not just racial, that's across all places where we see privilege.
Absolutely. You just illustrated it, right? Like, sometimes the most loving thing white people can do is have this conversation without us.
Amen.
Sometimes the most loving thing white people can do is to have this conversation without people of color. Because when you bring people of color into the room, now it's not that we shouldn't be at the table in some of these conversations, but sometimes we have to rehash pain. We got to explain why we feel this way, and that's not always helpful. It can wear people down to the point where they need self-care or they need to separate. So sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say, we're going to talk about this, and you don't have to say a word. It's like, hallelujah. Praise the Lord. Because when we start talking about it like there are all these things we got to work through, and am I being too aggressive? Do they know my heart? And that's gymnastics that emotionally is draining. And so sometimes it's important to just say, you know what, like, when I was doing work, we haven't started doing this in Detroit yet because most of my time pastoring there has been in the pandemic. But when I was ministering in Greensboro, North Carolina, we would have what we call caucus groups. And we had kind of a group of people in the city, pastors and other leaders, who were not only having this conversation, but also were doing work addressing some of the systems in our city. And the caucus group was, sometimes we would have a white caucus where all the white people met, and we would have an African American caucus, or we'd have a Latino caucus, or we would have Asian, or we would have all the people of color together. And people used to think like, man, you're being so divisive. Like, why are y'all separating? I thought y'all were the church. And think about it this way. Like, sometimes when I counsel a married couple, we'll get to a certain point where I realize, you know what? I need to talk to the husband. Babe, you need to talk to the wife. We're going to go talk separately, not to keep us separate, but we need to get to some issues with him, and you need to get to some issues with her so that we're healthier when we come back together. Does that make sense? So it's not to stay separate, it's actually to deal with things that may not be a good space to deal with together in one room or in one space. And so sometimes some of the most loving things I've seen is when white people deal with this within their own groups. Now, there are a lot of, I wish I had time to deal with this, but I don't today. There are a lot of reasons why this whole conversation is difficult for the white community. And one of the reasons is most time we don't talk about what people had to go through to become white in the US. Like there are books like When the Irish Became White, or When Jews, or How Jews Became White. Like people gave up their names, they gave up their culture, they gave up their language, they gave up their food. They gave up so many things to become white. And what tends to happen is we only talk about the pain of people of color, and we don't address what it took for people to become white in the US. And that journey, now I'm not comparing pain, I'm not comparing 400 years of slavery to the ghettos of Jewish groups in the US. I'm not comparing those, and that's where we miss it. That's what happens with the BLM and the Blue Lives Matter. Like we start comparing, and that's never, you're never gonna end well there. But when we can name the realities of what we've experienced, there's an exercise I do sometimes when I do racial reconciliation retreats. And the exercise is we'll get people together. It's kind of like the caucus. And I'll get black folk together and I'll say, what do you like about being black, right? And African-American folk are gonna say something different than somebody from Ghana or Kenya or the Caribbean, right? But there's some similarities, right? Different, but similar. And then I'll get Hispanic or Latino people together and say, what do you like about being Latino, right? And usually, like when you ask that question, people just start writing. Ooh, yes. Ooh, y'all did that too? Yes. And then I'll ask the question, what do you like about being white? And there is silence. And then somebody will start talking about, well, my Swedish grandmother, or my Dutch grandfather, or like they'll start to connect some things. But the first few minutes, it's silent. And it's silent because there was something that white people had to do to become white. It was to remove as much of that as possible in order to become a part of a larger group of people. And until there's a process of rediscovery and a process of healing, of being in touch with that experience, sometimes we will not be able to connect because there is not a connection with pain, and there isn't a connection with history and culture, and that is part of the work. I believe part of the church's responsibility is to help people rediscover that identity, to rediscover that culture. Now, part of the challenge is sometimes we don't want to think about it, we don't want to remember it because of all the pain. Well, the truth of the matter is people of color deal with that all the time, right? And part of what will connect us is the reality that we both had to let go of some stuff. We both had to walk away from some things to be who we are in the US. And when we can connect over that experience together, there's some healing that can happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. The reality is, even though the oppression and all that kind of stuff, if I had a screen, I put up like how, you've seen the iceberg thing, right? Where 10% of the iceberg is above the water, 90% is below the water. The 10% that is above the water is how some of these issues affect people of color. Like that's the 10%. What I'm talking about is what's beneath the surface that we don't talk about. And what we don't talk about is the fact that there were certain cultural identifiers that were removed from white people, and that not only were people of color identities reshaped, but white people were too. And for example, and this is hard to say, but I'm just gonna say it, and it speaks to this issue. Like, it's hard for me to understand how and this is not true for all white people, so hear me, but just hear me out. It's hard for me to understand how people could get to a point where at one point of our nation's history, it would have been normal to walk out of church on Sunday and to lynch people on property here, and for it to be like a celebration, like watching a movie. Like at one point in our nation's history, that was normal. Are you with me? Yes. That was normal. Yes. And so the question becomes, how do we get to a place as Christians or as people where like in our soul, in our heart, to walk out of church talking about Jesus, talking about love, talking about the kingdom, and think that's okay? And so there's healing that had to take place, right? Like as you look at the civil rights movement and some of the sneers and the anger and the animosity in people's eyes when they were throwing things at people and turning on, the water and sending dogs, like there's something there that we have to deal with, right? Like we got to deal with that. And what often happens is we act like, we've come out of this, it's no longer a problem. But what I'm saying is that 90% under the surface, that stuff has to be worked through, right? That stuff has to be named, that stuff has to be dealt with. And it's not about pointing the finger, but it's saying we got some healing that we usually don't talk about, that we got to deal with, not just people of color, white folks too. And the other part of this is also true. Like when I was talking about my black church, which I love, my black church in North Carolina, I love it. But like at times, it felt like we cared more about being black than we cared about being Christians. And we can get into this nationalism thing instead of kingdom stuff. And that needs to be exposed too. So it's not just the issues in the white church or white community that needs to be exposed. Sometimes it's issue in people of color communities, because in that 90%, we've all been negatively impacted by racism. Our identities have all been misshaped and out of line with what Scripture says, all of us. It just shows up in different ways, right? And so we just need to expose all of that so that we can walk in freedom as a church. And when we get to those places where we can be honest about those things and expose the elephants, like you see some freedom, like their time. I'll never forget when a white guy that I did this work with said to me, "I'm so tired of you only talking about how racism affects people of color." And I looked at him. This was before I became more of a Martin. I was still kind of a Malcolm back then. And I was like, and this was a brother that I loved, I was like, "Tell me, Mr. White Man, how racism has hurt you." And this was a guy that was a friend of mine, right? But he began to unpack this stuff that I just described about how the Irish became white, how Jews became white, and it shed light on something I had never seen before. And I saw him walk in that rediscovery of his own culture and his own roots. And we began to connect on things that I normally would have never connected with him on, because I saw him walking through pain too. I saw him walking through rediscovery too. And that's a special, I believe, sacred space that I think we have to get back to. So, yep.
Really good. Thanks, Santes. Here's a great question. Have you ever experienced negative backlash to your message? And what have you found to be the best response, if any, when that happens?
Yes. The worst response, though, is not when people say ugly things, when they make accusations about my character or my motives. You know what the worst thing is?
No response.
Silence. That's the worst. Silence. Indifference. That hurts way more. Because at least I know where you stand when you say something ugly. The biggest problem in our nation is not, it's not the hatred and the bigotry that is visible. The worst part of this is the silence of well-meaning good people who say nothing and do nothing. That's far worse. And so that's the part that's really important to put out there and say it's not that. Like it's the majority who say nothing and do nothing and just move on. Who, take this student, his name was Ian, take this student who I learned so much in that day, and then I never bring it up again. I never talk about it again. I never address it again. I never use that experience to transform how I lead. I just keep moving. Like that's probably the most damaging response for me personally. I can deal with the negativity. Matter of fact, I can engage that a lot better. And so some people may ask, like, how do you engage the smart comments or whatever? And sometimes it's actually not. It's not very divisive. People just have honest questions that they're struggling with, right? And what I've found is I try to find some commonality. So for example, maybe a year ago, I put a post on Facebook that was something to help me frame how I was dealing with what was going on. And another guy who was a police chaplain reached out and said some things. He's a pastor too. And my immediate response was like, I need to hear his story. And so I said to him, I don't really want to go back and forth on Facebook. I'd like to talk to you, like person to person. Because no matter what I explained on Facebook, like it probably would not be heard until like we talk face to face. So I began to share with him that my dad was a police officer. Like he was in law enforcement, and I come from a military family. Like I was in ROTC growing up, and so we started to find these common places where we had shared passion, and we started to see each other as people rather than issues to debate about. And so what I say to people when they run into those struggles is, find ways that you can connect with the person. If you can't connect with the person, don't debate the issue. That's my approach. If you can't have a conversation with the person, don't debate the issue. Because it just becomes a poor witness of who we are as believers. Because we need to be able to see each other in the Imago Dei and ask questions. And he helped me with some issues, like of what he saw as a chaplain, and how some of the things that sometimes are said and done are offensive or are misunderstood from police officers. And I appreciated that conversation. And then he also heard some of the things that I was sharing about how people may feel on the other side of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, if I'm correct, you, after the George Floyd incident, wrote a litany or a liturgy that you put on Facebook. We copy and pasted that and used it in our service a couple Sundays after the George Floyd incident. That raised some stuff with some people. And I think it's interesting that as I think back now, and by the way, we're gonna do a series in February which kind of comes back to some of these issues. We're gonna look at Moses and how God had a heart, and how God sees, hears, laments, and acts, and calls us to do the same. We're going to use that litany again in that series. I think it'll play differently with us because we know you now a little bit. And there were a lot of people that really appreciated it, and some that didn't, because it did sort of deal with that police officer, African American conflict or conversation that's really, in many ways, at the heart, I think, of some of the biggest division we have right now around these issues. So my point in saying that is to stress your point that just having you here, and it's not like we're all buddy, but we don't know you really well, but just by knowing you the little bit we know you, that just, we now hear your heart, I think, in that more than we did just being something that we got off the internet and shared in a Sunday morning service. I think that's really important. And I think you're right about like really having these conversations with people that we're willing to walk through with them. I think in my own life, I'm like, I never really want to start a conversation like this that I'm not willing to walk through whatever the implications of that are. I don't want to just throw stuff out there and say things. I want to walk through it with people as best I can. And we've got a couple questions that kind of are the same, that kind of go back to how you ended the sermon. I'd maybe end with these two questions, and there's several of them like this. But you mentioned in the sermon that you would maybe come back to some of these. So the questions are about resources and practical steps. And you gave some of those, but maybe fleshing out some of that a little bit more, or speaking to some that you listed that maybe you felt like you ran out of time. What are some resources that we can access either individually or as a church? And then what are some practical steps? Again, you gave us a whole list, but how maybe that'll end our time. So like, what should we do as we leave here?
Yeah, great question. I think before I get there, let me say this. I think rooted in the most difficult part of this conversation is usually fear. And that's not always what we talk about, but that's usually what's at the root of it. Sometimes the fear is a loss of control. Sometimes the fear is a loss of power. Sometimes the fear is the inability to control the narrative of what other people think about you. And so a lot of the things that we are talking about, like, it really boils down to fear. There's a documentary that came out years ago. This is a great resource. You might not like some of the language in it, so I'm going to warn you from the beginning. But I used it all the time when I worked in higher education, and it's dated now. Matter of fact, a few of us are trying to do a Christian version of it. But it's called The Color of Fear. And there's a point, without spoiling it, where you get to a certain part of the documentary. It's done by a guy by the name of Leigh Manoir, who facilitates it. And there's this guy named David, and he's a white guy, and Leigh is asking David, what's keeping you from believing that what Victor, who's another guy in the film, is saying, like, what's keeping you from believing that it's actually true, that what he's talking about, his experience, that is actually real for him. In that moment, David just breaks down, and he's like, because if that's true, then, like, I haven't seen that, and I haven't experienced that, and that would be horrible, like, if that were true. And Leigh leans in and says, what if it is true? And I think the reality of this conversation is that we all have different experiences. And unfortunately, what's easier for us to believe is that other people are experiencing the world around us the way we are. But unfortunately, that's not true. And what's really important for us as believers, to really be able to love people where they are, is to have a posture of a learner and a listener, to where we're willing to engage and embrace the possibility that life isn't happening in other people's experiences always the way it's happening with us. And if we're willing to go there, I think we could grow a lot. But I would say some resources. What I'll do is I'll send a whole list of things that you can share with the congregation. But there are multiple TV shows I encourage you to watch. There are many documentaries. There are conferences for Christians that I think are really helpful. There are trainings that you could go through individually or as a church or as a business, in the community, cultural intelligence, unconscious bias. I think there are also multiple books. I'm an avid reader. I try to read a book a week. I don't always get there, but that's my goal. But there are a ton of podcasts that are also out there that are really helpful around these conversations, that are done by believers and people who are theologically sound. Now, I must say, don't just go listen to any podcast. Come on, say amen. Because some stuff out there is a little woo. But there's some great resources out there. I think the other piece that might be helpful is really making a decision, like, what are some steps you can take personally? One of those is to really make a decision. Let me end with this story. For a long time, I was only mentored by men. And about 10 years ago, somebody challenged me to be mentored by a woman. And I was like, yeah, I can do that, sure. And so I invited or asked this amazing leader in the church I was a part of if she would mentor me. And we got into this heated debate point. And she said, okay, all right, what? You're not listening. She said, when you go home, I want you to look at your bookshelf. And I want you to take off every book that is written by a woman or written by a person of color who's not black. She said, do it, home office, church office. And I was like, whatever, I got plenty, right? So I go home and I'm like, I know I got a lot of stuff. She's just trying to make me feel bad, right? And so I started looking and looking and looking. I pulled out of 300 books, do you know how many I pulled off the shelf? 12. 12 out of 300. I sat at my desk and just began to weep. Here I am as a multi-ethnic leader, and my paradigm is very male-driven and very black-white. And it was convicting. And I called her and I said, why did you have me do this? She said, I just needed you to see how black and white and how male dominated your worldview is. And if you're gonna lead well going forward, you gotta be willing to change that. And that was over 10 years ago. And I'm not where I need to be, but I'm striving to get better. My mentor that I see the most right now is a white woman. She speaks into my leadership probably more than anybody else right now. And it was because of a black woman who mentored me over 10 years ago. Are you with me? So sometimes we have to change who's speaking into your life. Who do you listen to? Who has that authority to correct and to broaden your perspective? And unfortunately, for a long time, it was black men and white men. And I wasn't really listening to my indigenous brothers and sisters. I wasn't listening to my Asian brothers and sisters. I wasn't listening to my Hispanic brothers and sisters. I wasn't reading their material. I wasn't going to conferences that were led by them. I was almost always at a table that was white or black led and was mostly male led. And I got convicted. And that was not to shame me. It was just to expose a blind spot that if I wanted to get better, I need to be honest about that. So.
Which I think when people ask for a practical next step, you've just shown how to do that. I think we look for the magic bullet, right? The thing that will change this. And I think sometimes it's just like being willing to do something different and maybe something hard. And your story illustrates that. Man, it's been good. Thank you all for the questions. I know we didn't get to most of them. I apologize. I also recognize that you've been here for a while. I don't know if there's any donuts left. Do we finish off the donuts? There's a few left, okay. But thank you all for coming. How about one more round of applause for Santes? And so yeah, you're dismissed. He'll be up here if you want to chat for briefly. Don't keep him up for an hour, but I'm sure he's glad to interact with anyone that wants to come up and chat with him for a bit. Thanks for coming. And we will, just as a quick reminder, we will not have a service next week. It's online only, but we'll see you at the Christmas Eve service. I can't believe it's already Christmas Eve, but that'll be this Friday, I guess. Thanks for being here.
Yes.